the elites in Russia, Vladimir Putin just cannot afford to fight. So that's why we see right now in Donbass that there is a huge pushback of the Russian troops. The amount of territory they've fought over during the course of the recent period has been about the size of the city of Chicago, to give some sort of relative comparison. And though that sounds impressive, and they often make a lot about it, the fact is they've only been able to maintain control of about 13% of it. That's amazing, 13%. But more than that, it's just the beginning of the problems. The problems get worse when you look at the fact that that his troops are increasingly deserting at numbers that are much higher than was anticipated before. New reports coming out of Russia say that Putin himself is not anxious to do a massive call-up of mobilization to the military, and that's largely due to economic reasons. Now, something that we should understand about Vladimir Putin, part of the strategy, that's something I've argued many times before, but I think when we're looking at what's happening inside of Ukraine, this is really the crux of the matter of where I think a lot of people are getting it wrong. What is happening in Donbass is ultimately not the strategy of the war. That is a tactic of the war. That is something that is necessary for him to be able to achieve his aims, his objectives. And those objectives include taking Kiev, introducing a different government, getting rid of the Ukrainian military, demilitarizing Ukraine, that is, making sure that Ukraine can't join NATO. These are the objectives that he has. But part of the Donbass, whether a village is taken or not, doesn't fundamentally change his goal. According to CIA reports, Vladimir Putin's objectives have not changed since the beginning of the war. His objectives remain to take all of Ukraine. Now, that's increasingly unrealistic. And actually, there's a video that comes out right after this about why that is such a fairy tale. But when we look at what is happening today, take note of this. The elites in Russia, the billionaires, well, today they hold more money than they have ever held before. In fact, back in 2021, there's about $663 billion they had. Today, it's $697 billion. Now, what's interesting is, though, there are some of the billionaires who've disappeared. In fact, about 8 of them are no longer on the list. And the reason for that is simple. Vladimir Putin is increasingly allowing some of the different parties, some of the different groups within Russia to seize their assets. That's to make up for the lack of cash that's going around. We just saw the case of Vadim Moshkovich, the owner of Rus Agro, one of the largest companies in Russia. He had $7.6 billion in assets that was taken from him. That's all because of what? Well, it's because Vladimir Putin is trying to balance right now a spreadsheet that's in the red in Moscow. His government already has about $75 billion of debt for the year. That's more than 50% more than they projected for the entire year. They've already spent in the first half of the year. But it's also coming on the heels of a currency that's very expensive to maintain. Nobody wants rubles. People are trying to ditch rubles. And there's something that you'll notice in the Russian news a lot recently that's worth paying attention to. We see that the banks, the money changers, the cryptocurrencies are being raided by the police a lot. Now, why is that? What's going on there? Well, it's because they're trying to prevent people from taking out their money. They fear what will happen if all of a sudden people showed up and decided, I'd like to have my money. And that's why the government today is enacting more and more laws, in theory, to protect you from fraud, to protect you from having your money taken. But it's really not about that. What's it about? It's about making sure that the money stays in the banks so it's allowed to work still for the government. That's their end all objective. It's not about protecting you from fraud. It's about protecting the government's ability to have assets. You've seen now at this point, there's something else that's sort of fascinating. The government today has already talked about, actually the head of the central bank herself talked about the need to freeze deposits in the banks. That is to freeze things like the dollarized accounts, the euro accounts, so the government can eventually take them. Now, how do you think that makes the investors of Russia feel? How does it make the average person in Russia feel when they think that their banks might not be able to give them money back anymore because the government is going to take it? Of course, it scares a lot of people, but that's why they're enacting all these laws right now, to prevent people from taking out their liquidity. They want to make sure that they will be able to keep having that option open to them, to seize the assets from the common people of Russia. And that's a major feature of how they hope to finance the war. But the other aspect of this, and this is actually sort of a fascinating one, is that the government, in its official planning, which is publicly researchable, we know that in this quarter, the third quarter, they anticipated fundraising about $16 billion from selling government debt, that is to say, selling war bonds. But so far, well, they've had 4 of these bond auctions. Of those 4 bond auctions, we've saw 2 of them got canceled. because there's a lack of interest. One only raised 9% of the amount of money that they're hoping to raise. And the other one, they were unwilling to agree with the investors to pay the very high interest rates they wanted to take such risky loans. And in fact, just last month, we saw investors sell off $1 billion worth of loans, or I should say, of war bonds from the government. That's the largest sell off since 1998 when there was a collapse in the Russian economy. But right now, another indicator of how bad things are, people are taking out cash at the highest rate they have recorded. In fact, in June, it was a record month. But what we just saw so far in this month, they're taking out money 40% faster than they were then. More than that, they've taken out so many billions of dollars. We see it's creating tension in the banks. But Ukraine, it's attacking things like wild berries. And you might think wild berries is about the Amazon being struck, but that's not it. There's something much, much more interesting about wild berries. And that is that they owe a ton of money to VTB Bank. VTB Bank is the second largest bank in Russia. It's about 20% of the market. But imagine this today. They have wild berries, probably the one they have more loans to than any other company. And today, it doesn't look like wild berries is going to pay them back. Now, if they go bust, if the second biggest bank in Russia, 20% of market share, is unable to recover that money, that's going to put them into a disastrous situation. But these sorts of things are what Vladimir Putin is miscalculated on. He expected that this war would be able to continue, he'd be able to win, and it's because, well, everybody's going to need Russian oil and gas. Europe will never cut off Russian oil and gas. Now, the thought that that could change, that fundamentally there would be a demand for something other than Russian oil and gas, that there would be other options, quite literally never worked itself in to the Kremlin's plans. But there's another aspect of this. And thank you, everyone who's gotten here. Greetings, everybody. I'm trying to read the comments. It's actually harder than you would think to have a train of thought and to read the comments, especially with the small letters that they are. But I'll try to respond to comments if there are any. When we look at what he was betting on, it was that there would still be this flow of money coming in, that this flow of money coming from the sale of oil and gas would be enough to finance the government, finance the huge war costs that were expected. They did expect it to be expensive, but not this expensive. But that's something that becomes impossible, simply impossible. And hence why they're pushing it on the regions of Russia. Russia has federalism, like the United States, sort of. Not really, but it's like that, where every one of the regions has its own, let's say, state. It's called oblast in Russian, but they have their own decision-making authority at the local level, where they're trying to push a lot of the cost, such as financing the bonuses for people to join the military, down to that level. But at this point, it's become impossible for them. Today, there's 9.3 times more deficits in the regions than when the invasion first began. In fact, their combined deficit increased another 91% during the last year alone. Nearly 2 in 3 deficit regions now exceeds 10% of revenue. That's not a good sign, especially because Putin is counting on them to be the ones who will help with the mobilization, to be the ones that will help to pay people to join the military. But how can they afford that? How can you realistically afford to pay a soldier, or let's say wipe away the debts of $120,000 of a soldier, pay a sign-on bonus of $20,000, pay a monthly salary of thousands more? It's far more than what the Russian state can afford today. Now, Vladimir Putin seems to be unaware of this. He doesn't seem to be taking this into account as to how bad the situation is. And it is actually a huge departure. When he was younger, he was known to be actually pretty open-minded to economics. He would meet with economists, he would discuss what was going on, and they had, from what I've heard, to be quite lively discussions. Today, he's an echo chamber. As you know, he spent most of the past year locked away in a bunker. He simply doesn't go out. And that's why he's probably not aware of how bad it is even in Moscow. Moscow, it's had to cut its healthcare spending by 25%. Today, it's looking at borrowing about $17.9 billion to pay for its cost. That's what the capital's like, the most important city in the country. So when you look at that, what do you expect the federal government to do? Historically, regions, when they started to run out of money, would go to the federal government. But the federal government, well, today, oil refining, it's down 25% year over year. Roughly 1 out of every 4 barrels of refining output has disappeared compared to last year. That's a stunning statistic. Remember, about 45% of the Russian national budget is coming from oil and gas. So we get back to the elites. How does this affect them? With the lack of liquidity, the lack of cash, Vladimir Putin has to go to them, has to shake them down for money to pay for a war. But that leads to a very good question. Do I really need Putin any longer? Has he outgrown his usefulness? And that's a question I think is increasingly coming up, evidenced by the fact that his increased paranoia is leading to some of the decisions he's making. But it's also a very reasonable question for the elites to ask. Vladimir Putin came to power at a point in time when Russia had a high degree of instability. He was a guy who tried to sell himself as the one who's going to create stability. But today, he's creating the opposite. And a lot of people are losing money. Those elites who have made billions of dollars, and it's a very small crew of them, well, they are the ones that are generally very close to Vladimir Putin personally. And in fact, when you look at businesses that have been nationalized in Russia, tied to the elites in the past couple of years, I want to say the numbers 96% of the assets have ended up in the hands of people that are personally close to Vladimir Putin. So, though they are becoming very wealthy and they're the ones who he actually speaks to, he's probably left with the impression that the war is popular, that the war is being supported. And that's because some of the elites, his friends, are becoming very wealthy. But for the other elites, the elites who are losing money, this isn't a good deal. We just saw, in fact, there was a video yesterday about this, what's going on right now with Chechnya. We see that the Chechen leader, Kadyrov, he's not very happy, and there's increasing tensions there. There's increasing the risk that Chechnya could become destabilized, and that's something that could radically change the outcome of what we see in the next few years. But between these different things, how do we interpret what is likely to happen? How do we interpret what is likely to happen if Vladimir Putin doesn't make substantial changes, like end the war, which is actually, it's not so easy as it might sound. Keep in mind, if he ends the war, that would fix the immediate problem of the ongoing monthly cost. But the Russian economy today is so heavily leveraged in this war, so much is invested in this war, so many people have jobs only because of the war, that as he said just last week, he said, what would we do if the special military operation were to end? What would he do with the tons of soldiers who wouldn't have a job, or the tons of soldiers returning to Moscow with demands? He understands that would be something that could be destabilizing to his regime as well. And you can be absolutely certain that is something that he does worry about. Now, another aspect of this, and I think it's probably where Putin's mind is going right now, is what we are currently seeing occur in the military. The military itself has been persecuted. We've seen 16 generals arrested in the past 4 years in the Russian military. That's a huge number. That's more than all of the NATO countries combined, not surprisingly. But when you look at those arrests, there's a commonality we see between them. Obviously, there's all the people close to Shoigu. He is the former Minister of Defense. All of his deputies, they're in jail or waiting to go to jail or waiting their trials to go to jail, but it's not working out very well for them. But then go a step further. Look at the other ones who they've arrested. I did some research into this, and actually, haven't noticed anyone else published about this, but it's worth checking out. If you look at the guys who are getting arrested, there's a commonality. Many of them were in charge of either acquisitions or they were in charge of things like contracts with the government in other forms, handling money. So why would that be? Well, sure enough, they have the revenue streams. Now, that's what makes them very interesting. But also, there's one specific general who got arrested who made even more sense. He was in charge of things like promotions in the military and assignments. So why does he matter? Because undoubtedly, he's probably the most bribed person by the other officers in the Russian military. He decides where you're going to go on your next assignment, so he's obviously important. But if he was taking bribes from the other officers, undoubtedly he was also writing it down. When you're taking any sort of money, you record it, so you know later on what the agreement was. So imagine what they found when they raided his house or his office, and they found his little black book here of bribes. That all of a sudden exposes a lot of the other parts of the military to also being blackmailed by the FSB. The FSB has shown itself routinely to be most interested in blackmail, making sure they can make money from situations, setting up rackets. In fact, some of the big moves we've just seen in St. Petersburg, the arrest of some of the criminal authorities there, ones who are close to Putin, it looks like that's what the story was really about. How is it that they could consolidate their rackets in the black markets that are now opening up in Russia? Many people think of the Putin regime, as I've said plenty of times before, as just a government, and it's a huge flaw. Don't think of it that way. It's probably the biggest mistake someone can make. Think of Russia as being just a government. It is not. The Putin regime is nothing more than a criminal family. and it's operating through the guise of being a government. It uses all the niceties. It uses things like diplomacy. It uses things like having a military or having an intelligence service. But all of that is not to serve the interest of the state. That's to serve the interest of the elites close to Putin to make sure they can consolidate as much wealth as possible. Some people have asked me before, why is it that the billionaires, if you have $12 billion, why do you need $13 billion? Why $14 billion? Does it really matter at that point? Many years ago, I asked a former Russian oligarch who fled the country that very question. I was very young. And his answer was actually pretty logical. He said it's actually not about having more wealth. It's not about buying more yachts. It's about understanding that one day there'll be a civil war in Russia over the wealth. Who actually controls these oil refiners? Who controls these factories? And the guy who has more money will have more of a war chest. And that guy will survive this civil war. The ones that don't have money, they'll be washed out. It'll be taken from them. So we return back to the elites in Russia, the constituency of Vladimir Putin. Now imagine how they're looking at the situation. You might love Vladimir Putin. You might think he's great, but ultimately you realize his day will come to an end. When that day comes, if you're not part of his inner circle, you're not part of the group who he trusts the most, well, you can be pretty sure the baton is going to be passed to somebody else. And if that other group comes to power, for instance, if you're in the military and you know very well the FSB is not going to be passing any batons your way, it's a guarantee that they will be liquidating you and your family and all of your assets so they can put it in their pockets, not your pockets. But being cognizant of that, understanding that, the wisest thing you can do is to make moves now to consolidate your own power, to make sure that power is not taken from you once Putin is no longer there, because that is actually probably the highest risk you face as a person as well as for a future. The best thing you could do, act now to preserve yourself. And that means seizing power. Now, some people might say it's unrealistic, but I'd argue the contrary. There's very few countries in this world where we've seen active rebellions in the military where not only did it go very far, in the case of Prigozhin, the Wagner Group back in June a couple of years ago, but there's something even more impressive. The response of the public and the response of those who are supposed to defend Vladimir Putin. Consider this. Vladimir Putin is paying incredible sums of money for things like the National Guard. It's run by Zolotov, Viktor Zolotov. If you follow the channel, you've heard a lot about him. He was Vladimir Putin's bodyguard back in St. Petersburg about 30 years ago. But today, he is in charge of the Rosgvardia, National Guard. And it has about 350,000, 400,000 troops. But since the Prigozhin uprising, they've been allowed to keep in Moscow tanks. That's pretty shocking. Why would you need 36 tanks in Moscow? Keep in mind, tanks, it's for fighting with other tanks. Well, it's because they know there could be a military uprising. He's allowed it at this point. But look at the fascinating thing of what they did the day we saw the Prigozhin uprising. The fascinating thing, they did nothing. They in no way tried to slow down Prigozhin. According to ISW, Institute for Study of War, there is no video evidence whatsoever that they actually actively tried to stop Prigozhin. But they're not alone. The Chechens, they also did nothing to stop Prigozhin. That's shocking. They only had 100 kilometers to go. And despite 100 kilometers, they said they could not go that distance in the course of 5 hours because it was simply too much traffic. To me, that sounds like a pretty poor excuse. Your one job is to be a Praetorian Guard, to be the guys that come defend the regime no matter what. But when push came to shove, they didn't do anything. They ran away. So when you look at this, you might wonder, how about the Russian public? Were they standing there trying to stop Prigozhin's group, trying to make sure that he would not succeed in taking the capital? No. In fact, they came out. They greeted him. They took selfies with him. They thanked him. They brought him food. They treated his soldiers like heroes. Now, if you're Vladimir Putin, that should probably alarm you. But it should probably also alarm you at the same time that across Russia as a whole, Wagner Group, as well as Prigozhin, was viewed positively after that. That was a huge boost to their image, not a negative. And in fact, where did those Wagner troops end up? The ones who were, after Prigozhin died, killed. What happened to those troops? Well, I can tell you exactly where they are. At least a couple thousand of them today are in the Chechen units. So isn't that amazing? The Chechens, the ones who are supposed to be suppressing rebellions, well, we see a lot of them in the Akhmat brigade. Akhmat itself, as a unit, is sort of interesting. It's only 25% ethnic Chechen. The rest are mostly ethnic Russians and other parts of the country. But out of all the parts of Russia, you know where the lowest death rate is in the war? It's not Moscow or St. Petersburg. It's Chechnya. In fact, the death rate in Chechnya is far, far lower than other parts of the country. It's about, in fact, I'm going to say it's about 4.25 times lower than what it is for places like Moscow. So how's that possible? How's Chechnya, or the fierce fighters, avoiding this war? Once again, Vladimir Putin's calculations in this war, what we're seeing in Ukraine, it's not just about the battlefield. It's not what we're seeing in Donbass. It's about something far bigger. It's about how he maintains power and how this war is used or manipulated for him to consolidate power, to gain wealth with which he can curry favor or build his regime stronger. But all of it serves a purpose that's not as clear to us as we might initially think. The Ukrainian side, by comparison, is obviously much easier to understand. They've got a standard military, they have guys on the line, and it operates like a European country. I mean, just there's really not much of a difference. The Russian side, though, has a different calculation. Their calculation is about the consolidation of wealth, how they can make as much money as possible from this and benefit. What happens to the average Russian soldier, as we could tell from the meat assaults, is obviously not the concern of their officers or of anybody in the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin, though, faces a different hardship, and it's one that's likely to get worse in the near term. And that's the fact that those whom he trusts is becoming a very small circle, and that circle is shrinking all the time. There used to be a lot more people, like Shoigu, but Shoigu has been proven to be somebody whom he can't trust. And so he returns to people like Patrushev, a close friend from the KGB in the 1970s in St. Petersburg. But Patrushev, his son, the elder one, was a former minister of agriculture. In fact, his current lover is the minister of agriculture. He was considered to be the next person after Putin. A lot of people were sure about that. Just a couple of years ago, if you were to talk to a bunch of criminologists, I think a lot of them would have told you he's probably the guy that'll come after Putin. Putin's known him his whole life. He's young, he's intelligent, and his father is one of Putin's closest friends. But even there, it seems that all is not well. On one side, we know that his level of embezzlement from the banks, namely from the banks associated with the Ministry of Agriculture, there to give loans to farmers and things, the embezzlement reached such a level that it started to be a danger for the bank. More than that, we see that his father has been somewhat retired. He was shifted away from his really important position in national security to be in charge of maritime affairs and shipbuilding. But his younger brother, that's an interesting guy, he's in charge with another guy, with the son of the deputy director of the FSB. He's in charge of turning off the internet across Russia whenever they need to turn off the internet. You might think there's nothing to that, but it's actually pretty important because that company, it's getting millions of dollars of contracts every time that happens. But it raises a different question. Every time they turn off the internet, it's costing Russia millions of dollars of lost business. It's causing increasing friction and tension within the population, and especially among the elites. But if this guy's making a couple $1,000,000 every time it happens, he has something to gain from doing it. And that's, in fact, a perverse incentive. You're not supposed to incentivize somebody to do something that's bad for the economy. But in this case, they've done just that. Vladimir Putin is now surrounded by people who are gouging from the system in ways that is directly harmful to Russia, harmful for Russia's ability to operate as a national economy, to operate as a state, to operate as a military. But in the end, it seems none of them are considering one thing. What does this mean for Putin? And what does this mean for his war? Or, for that matter, the future of Russia? That's not what's driving these people. They're being driven by something different. A lot of people would argue, in fact, I gave a lecture recently with some professors, I won't criticize them directly, but professors from UK universities that are well known and American. And they were making the argument that, Putin is driven just by ideology. My greatest argument against that is just consider this. If he really was driven by ideology, they would stop embezzling the money. He could easily make an example out of a number of people. He could arrest them. They could be sent off to the camps. He could stop embezzling money himself, but they have chosen not to do that. So when given a decision point, to steal more money or to achieve their political objectives, they always choose to steal more money. That says everything we have to understand about Putin. He is a career criminal. He has spent decades around organized crime. His rise is tied to organized crime, and nothing has changed today. So when those around him are looking at the situation where the government is weak, where the government today is unable to defend itself from their theft, they don't slow it down. They speed it up. Because like any other criminal, the minute the cops aren't watching, there's a minute that they act. Now, when we're looking for what is happening overall, though, with how this will affect the regions of Russia and why that's a huge risk for Putin, consider this. Across Russia, many of the regions, for instance, the ones in the central part of the country, where they produce, let's say, oil and gas, they're deprived. The people there have been really upset, especially recently, as there's a lack of gasoline, a lack of diesel in the country. And typically, those central parts of the country, the gasoline and diesel is taken from there and sent to Moscow. Now, that makes a lot of sense if Moscow is your priority, and it's always been Russia's priority, actually, the Soviet Union. Even if you look at the ABS treaty, the ballistic missile treaties we had and things, the priority was always about protecting Moscow above all else. The United States wasn't. It was actually about being able to have counterstrikes. But neither here nor there. The Russians have chosen to prioritize the ability of having the fuel from Moscow and depriving the regions. But those regions, they're going broke. But they also realize we produce the oil in this country. We produce the gas. How is it possible that we're the ones going broke and we're the ones that don't have gasoline, though it's all coming out of the dirt here? We work in the companies that produce it. Why are we left with nothing? Well, guess who's taking an interest in that? We've seen now that different people, oligarchs, are taking more and more interest in these upset people, these disenfranchised people in the central part of the country, those who live near things like oil and gas reserves. At present, there's nothing actively happening that we can see, at least. But I think it's well enough worth taking a look at that, especially in the coming weeks, what will develop. Because I would bet there's some people right now speculating as to what happens after Putin falls. Who will actually own those reserves? Who will be the ones that have the means of production? And right now, there's a very good chance that could change hands. So among the signs we'd look for in the coming weeks, there's going to be a lot of signs, but it'll be just in the coming weeks. Look what's going on with the Russian economy. Look what's going on specifically with cash withdrawals. That's one thing I'm promising. It's going to be a lot. But those cash withdrawals, that's a sign that something's going south. The other thing to really look for, though, is the government trying to enact more and more of these laws to prevent how much money you could take out, to make sure that nobody can get to the reserves. Because if you take out your money, well, that means also the bank won't have enough money. And if the bank doesn't have enough money, from where will Putin be able to steal more for his war? That's problematic. So if it's going to be your money or the government's money, you can be pretty sure it's not going to be your money. But the external signs we should see, and I think this is actually sort of interesting. It's a hypothesis, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. Let's take a look. Look at what we go right now. We've seen a lot of people that seem to trip out of windows. That's probably going to increase. And the reason it increases, it's one of my favorite questions I always get asked. Why does it happen so much in Russia? It's actually probably different than what you might guess. Obviously, there's some people who they decide needs to take a trip out a window. But there's another side of this as well. There's a side that people simply have too much information. Let's imagine that you've been a faithful and a very good accountant or lawyer for many years. But the guy, this oligarch, has decided he has a new accountant, a new lawyer who he likes more. But you now have collected too much information. To let you just go your own way, that poses a risk to me. So having you around is just an operational risk. Even if you're going to be loyal, you'll never do anything wrong. Who knows that tomorrow you could be stopped flying to an airport and be interrogated about a separate case. And in the course of that, they find information about this oligarch. The oligarch benefits from you not going anywhere and not being able to talk to anybody. But that's typically why it happens in Russia. But whenever there's an increase of instability in Russia, we also see that. Now, I think there's probably a very good chance we'll see more of that. We've already seen just the past few weeks, a definite uptick, a strong uptick in those losses in various sectors, especially those who are dealing with things like oil and gas. Actually, when the war first began, that's where we saw a lot of them. I've pointed out to people before. You remember, I think it was last summer or summer before, it was last summer, when the Minister of Transport was found dead in his car, having shot himself twice in the back of the head. And he was fired by Putin the same day. Now, what's so interesting about that guy was a lot of people wondered why the Minister of Transport? Who cares that much? Well, he was, up until that point, in charge of the ports in Russia. But after that incident, the FSB took over the ports in Russia. Now, why are the ports so interesting? Well, obviously, you can set up a racket there. And you have to have information to have a racket, and that's where you do it. But there's another aspect of this as well. Those ports are today having a huge amount of turnover with things like the shadow fleet, the illegal trade of oil. That's something they're making lots of money in. The Russian government as a whole is something that is sort of pathetic, but also sick in the sense that whenever you're looking at what is happening, any sort of law that's passed, it usually should raise a question for you. Who is going to benefit from this? Which lot or which monopoly or which tycoon is somehow going to become wealthier due to this? I cite the example just 2 weeks ago. I was reading the news and I was sort of surprised. Why would they pass a very specific law that you cannot do crypto mining in Moscow? I thought, that's sort of funny for a city of about 20 million people in the metro area. Who cares? Why would they do this right now? And sure enough, it was only about a week later, we saw raids on the crypto mining facility owned by one of Putin's top deputies. And I thought that all of a sudden makes sense. So in advance, whoever it was that pushed this through, it was the FSB. I'll tell you who it is. It was the FSB. They pushed this through knowing very well that he had such assets. So if it became illegal, they gave them the justification necessary to raid these offices, to take those assets and to put it in their pocket. Whenever you see laws getting passed, there's usually a reason for it that's pretty easy to understand. But also look at this side. The private businesses in Russia who are trying to support Putin, who are trying to come through for him, who are trying to supply him with money to fight this war, well, they're very few and far between. When the war first started, there was an upsurge in popular support for the war in Russia, the rally around the flag effect, but that's dissipated because today the hard reality of what it's costing Russia is becoming noticed by everybody. Businesses in Russia today are bankrupting at a rate that is accelerated just this year. And in fact, if you look at the number of companies, more than 60% of people that work in retail expected sales to go down this year and the next. And I would say it's about 35% of people in retail, companies in retail, said that they are looking at the options to close down permanently. That's a lot of businesses closing down. But all of it's part of the same pattern. It's part of a pattern of people who don't have faith that the system is going to work. Now, for Putin, of course, what this means for the common person is probably not important, but it does matter to him on a different thing. That's tax revenue that disappears. That tax revenue was needed to pay people off and to pay for the military. But as Russia today is losing in Ukraine, as Russia today is not succeeding, and everybody in the country sees it, why would you want to donate more money to it? If they were going to win and Putin would take power and all of a sudden you could have a governor become a governor of some part of Ukraine, then it was a good investment. But if they're going to end up losing and you're going to end up sanctioned, why does that help you? And again, Vladimir Putin has become somebody who's exposing them to risk, not limiting their risk. And it's not what his job is supposed to be. So Vladimir Putin is in a difficult situation. He, on one side, has burnt his alliances. He's burnt his friendship with those who gave him power, those who are allowing him to stay in power this entire time, since 2000. But at the same time, the Russian military, he's allowing it to be ground down, to be destroyed. Those in the FSB understand that the military is a threat to them. Right? They have direct military force, coercive power. They could actually pose a direct threat to them as an entity or as the future heirs to the Russian Federation. And as a result of that, they don't see anything wrong with the fact that the Russian military is being destroyed. For them, that's one less competitor in what's coming. However, all of this logic, all these inside games in Russia have reached a critical stage. That's what the video that comes up right after this starts on the hour is about. It's reaching a critical stage because you could play these games. You can allow them to take losses. But what happens when the military really does start to break? What happens when they really are starting to be ejected from Ukraine, when they're losing territory, and they're losing now at a historic rate? At that point, it changes the entire dynamic because all of a sudden, it's not going to be what's going to be good for me to make money. It's going to be the entire system collapses. I can actually lose even more money. I could become a wanted man, or the other groups, they could come to power and get rid of me. Now everybody's exposed to more risk than ever before. And Ukraine's attacks on things like the wild berries, which is going to destabilize the banking sector, attacks on things like the oil industry, which is making the government go broke, attacks across the country that's driving up the insurance cost, driving up the cost for transport, destroying the ability to buy gasoline. All these things are cooperating together to put the Putin regime into a uniquely, and I would say, a very hot position, one for which Vladimir Putin very clearly does not have a strategic ends. He has no idea where to take this to. What do you do if within your own country, ending the war will lead to you being overthrown? Ending the war, well, that could lead to the military overthrowing you, or it could lead to those in the elites realizing they are weak. And right now is the best time to strike. But then you also run the risk of continuing the war. And right now you're losing territory. And more people are realizing that you are doing nothing. You can't even win this war. That means you are nothing more than a perfect risk. You're nothing more than somebody who has stolen money from them, taken money from them, promised them a better future, and not be able to produce it. And all this is happening on the heels of the elections for the Duma, the lower house of the parliament, which is scheduled for mid-September. All these things combined are leading to a situation in which Russia is, frankly, in our lifetimes, most certainly not been in exactly. It's had bad situations, but it's not ever had one like this. Vladimir Putin is increasingly putting himself, more than anyone else in Russia, into a direct risk. Because today, he answers to the elites. And the elites, they feel that they're being robbed. The people of Russia, they are living worse than ever. And overall, the justifications for the Putin regime, why do you need Vladimir Putin? Why should you bother to keep him around? It's becoming harder for people to answer that question. But most importantly, for the paymasters, those who are behind Vladimir Putin, those who are the crutch for his entire regime, they're realizing that perhaps they'd be better off without Vladimir Putin's leadership. That's why today Putin's regime is weaker than ever before.